Today we are going to be reading about Susan B. Anthony. What motivated Susan B. Anthony to fight for women and slaves? Listen to find out more. And also listen for our vocabulary words: abolitionists, ballots, influential, jury, and suffrage. Susan B. Anthony, an advocate for women's rights. Susan B. Anthony was born a very long time ago in Massachusetts in the year 1820. When she was a little girl, she did not know that she would grow up to be so influential. Here's our first vocabulary word: influential, which means having the ability to change people's minds or convince them of something. But that was to be her destiny. Her family certainly helped to shape the person she was to become. Susan B. Anthony as a young child. Susan's family was different from many other families. They were Quakers. A Quaker is a member of a religious group called the Religious Society of Friends. Quakers believe in their religion that all people are equal. Susan's family did not judge people based on color or whether they were male or female. In their eyes, everyone was equal. But a long time ago, when Susan was a young girl, not everyone thought that way. For one thing, many people thought that it was more important for boys to be educated than it was for girls or people of color. How would you have felt about that? How would you feel if only boys could go to school? Susan was lucky because her parents did not agree with this view. They wanted their daughter to receive a good education. Susan attending school. When Susan was 6 years old, she went to school. One day, a teacher at the school refused to teach Susan a difficult math problem because she was a girl. As a result, her parents decided that Susan should be educated at home. Later, Susan attended a Quaker boarding school near Philadelphia. Does anybody know what a boarding school is? A boarding school is one where students live at the school rather than go home at the end of the school day. When her parents struggled to pay the fees, however, she left school and finished her education at home. Later, Susan became a teacher. Susan eventually became a headmistress, or the person in charge of a school. Susan worked hard to help her family financially. Susan quickly discovered, though, that female teachers earned less money than male teachers for doing the very same job. Horsedrawn carriage at Susan's house. When Susan was 29 years old, she left the world of education and settled in her family home. Susan's family was now living near Rochester in New York. It was during this time that she met some very brave people who were trying to abolish or end slavery in the United States. What does it mean to abolish something? Abolish means to end something. These people were called abolitionists. Secret meetings were held late at night in her family home. Susan became involved too. Her heart began to tell her that it was important that she tried to make the world a fairer place. So Susan decided that she would join the fight to abolish slavery. What do you think it means to abolish slavery? A long and difficult journey had begun. In the early days of the Civil War, Susan helped to organize women's groups to speak out about slavery. This was not an easy thing to do. Back then, people did not have computers or cell phones. Susan and her supporters had to travel in horse-drawn carriages and communicate by letter. Newspapers printed many articles that criticized her views and called her a troublemaker. Susan did not care. She was fearless. I noticed a connection between how Susan B. Anthony felt and her actions. Reread this sentence. Her heart began to tell her that it was important that she tried to make the world a fairer place, so Susan decided that she would join the fight to abolish slavery. What do you mean What do you think she means by this? And what do you think fearless means? While the Civil War raged in January of 1863, President Abraham Lincoln took an important step towards ending slavery when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This proclamation or statement announced that the government intended to free all slaves in the United States. This meant that former slaves could make decisions about their own lives and that they could receive money for the work they did. In December of 1865, after the Civil War, slavery was abolished or ended completely. In the next few years after the Civil War, the law was changed so that former slaves became citizens and male slaves were given the right to vote. Susan was very happy that former male slaves had gained these rights. She was extremely unhappy, however, that women didn't have the same rights. The next fight was about to begin. It might be difficult to believe now, but when Susan was alive, women had very few rights. As you have discovered, back then, many people did not think that it was important to educate girls. Women had very limited roles or small jobs in their communities. They could attend meetings, but were not allowed to speak in public, hold office, or vote. Women were not allowed to become doctors or lawyers. Few girls stayed in school beyond the 8th grade. Married women could not own property. If they did own property before they got married, they had to turn it over to their husbands after they got married. Here's Amelia Bloomer, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Susan had hoped that former abolitionists would now support women's rights. What did the abolitionists want to end again? She was disappointed to discover that many men who had helped to abolish slavery did not believe that women should have suffrage or the right to vote. Susan was determined to change this view. Susan joined forces with two women named Amelia Bloomer and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Amelia Bloomer was the woman on the left, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton is the woman on the right. Together, they began to fight for women's rights. Women like Susan, who campaigned against these laws, became known as suffragettes, or women who fought for women's suffrage. Remember, we learned she was unhappy about the fact that women couldn't vote? So what did she decide to do? Susan holding the revolution. Susan became secretary of the American Equal Rights Association. She traveled all over the country by wagon, carriage, and train, speaking about women's suffrage. She organized petitions and clubs, and she wrote newspaper articles. Susan also became publisher of The Revolution, a newspaper dedicated to women's issues. A publisher is a person who's in charge of a newspaper. Printed on the front page of this newspaper were the words, "Men, their rights, and nothing more. Women, their rights, and nothing less." What do you think that meant? Susan invested her own money in the newspaper. Continuing the fight for women's rights, Susan also helped to found or start the National Suffrage Association. When Susan ran out of money, she gave up her position at the newspaper and had to find another way to make money. She began to tour the country, speaking to groups that paid to hear her speak. Here we have Susan voting. Susan was in her 50s when she took her campaign one step farther. She tried to cast her vote for president. The word cast here means the act of voting. The word cast can also mean the hard covering put on a body when you break a bone so that it can heal. She and several other women marched into a New York barbershop where male voters were voting. A barbershop is a place where men go to get their hair cut. The women held a protest. They demanded the right to vote. The men in charge were unsure of what to do. They were unable to stop the women, so the women finally voted in the election, And so, in 1872, about 50 years before it was legal to do so, Susan and the other women cast their ballots for President of the United States. Do you see that small piece of paper in the women's hands? That's called a ballot. And a ballot is a piece of paper which you use to write your vote. 2 weeks later, Susan was arrested and charged with illegal voting. Her arrest caused a national uproar. Susan was not afraid. She asked the general public to consider, is it a crime for a United States citizen to vote? The judge in the trial did not think women should have the right to vote. He decided against Susan before the trial even started. He did not even let her talk. He ordered the jury to find her guilty. A jury is a group of people who sit at a trial and decide whether someone is guilty of the crime with which they are charged. He then asked Susan if she had anything to say. I have many things to say, for in your ordered verdict of guilty, you have trampled underfoot every vital principle of our government. My natural rights, my civil rights, my political rights, my judicial rights are all alike ignored. What do you think she was saying here? The judge tried to quiet Susan, but she continued to speak. He sentenced her to pay a fine of $100, which was a lot of money back then. Susan's response was to say, I shall never pay $1 of your unjust penalty, and she never did. Here's Susan speaking to a large crowd. By the end of the 19th century, people's views about Susan B. Anthony began to change. She had become a national heroine. What is a heroine? A heroine is a female hero. Boys are heroes and girls are heroines. Susan continued to travel the country speaking for women's voting rights. Now people couldn't wait to hear her speak. She became president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, a job she held until the age of 80 when she retired. 6 years later, on March 13, 1906, Susan B. Anthony died in Rochester, New York. She had worked for more than 50 years, a half of a century, for women's rights. Although she did not live to see women get the right to vote when the 19th Amendment to the Constitution passed in 1920, she helped to make it happen. Susan B. Anthony was quite an amazing woman. She was prepared to stand up and fight for what she believed was right. Do you think you would have enough courage to do the same?